Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. I'll read in Haitian Creole and Gabby will read in English.
Hear the word of the Lord.
Le sa, Pierre proche boko de Jésus. Li di li kon sa, Maître, combien fois pour moi pardonner frère moi, le li fèm yon bagay mal? 7 fois kon sa? Jésus répondit, non, Pierre, moi pas dit ou pardonner li 7 fois, mais pardonner li 77 fois 7 fois. Mais qui j'en ça a passé dans pays roi qui dans ciel là? C'est un coup yon roi qui te vle faire règlement avec domestique li yo. Li te fait commencer faire règlement en lè yon mené yon bali qui te douel 50,000 goud. Mais nom là, pas de gain de quoi payer tout l'argent ça. Met là, bay l'ordre pour yo vendre li tant kou esclave. Li même, madame li, petite li, yo ensemble à tout ça yo te gain pour payer dette là.
Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and that all he had be sold to repay the debt.
Domestique la tombe à genoux devant maître la. Li di li, maître, tant pris souple, prends yon ti patience pour moi. M'a payé tout l'argent. Qui maître domestique la fait le mal, li quitte l'argent là pour li quitte l'aller. Le domestique la sorti, li kontre ak yon camarade qui te douel 100 goud. Li kembel, li point tranglel, li dil, payem sa ou dwe mwen la. Camarade la, la ge koli a terre. Li di lot la, tant pwe, point yon ti patience pour moi, ma paye ou.
At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.
Men lot la patande, li fè met camarade lan nan prison pour jouk le li fin paye sa li dwe ya. Le lot domestique la wè sak te rive, sa te fè yo mal en pile. Yal raconte met la sak te pase. Le sa, met la fè rele domestique la. Li dil kon sa, gade jan ou méchant. Moi quitte tout l'argent ça pour ou, parce que ou te mande moi faire ça pour ou. Ou te doué gen pitié pour camarade ou, même gens moi te gen pitié pour ou. Met la fait gros colère, li fait li mette monsieur nan prison pour yo bat li, juk li fin payer tout ça li te ouais, tout ça li te doué ya.
But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have all the mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he paid back what he had owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, LaFleur family. So glad to be with you guys today. Before we get started with the sermon, a couple of important announcements for our church's life. First off, just a warm thank you again to Dean. Dean has done an incredible job, like Trisha, like Pastor Rob, with our own children. So we've been co-workers, but also parents with them, and we've just appreciated his love and care for the kids so much. Another thing that I do want to make us aware of is that this next month, really for our country, is going to be really chaotic, and not so much because of some big things we're doing here at the church, but really because of the presidential election. If it's anything like it was 4 years ago, there's going to be a lot of news reports, a lot of debates, a lot of arguments, a lot of things that are going to be happening in the life of our country, and it'll feel really easy to just get caught up in that and feel anxious and feel destabilized because of that. And so throughout this season, we wanted to add a few disciplines into the life of our church so that we can feel more anchored and we'll feel like we remember our identity as Christ followers. So throughout the month of October, we're really making this a month devoted to prayer, fasting, and communion. 3 things that we'll be doing. First off, every week in the month of October, we're going to release a daily prayer guide for you to pray through. It was created by our intercessory prayer leaders, Keith Igarashi, Robin Kane, Judy Niebel, Rosella Collins. And so every day you'll be able to pray and go to God in prayer and do that with other people in our church as a way to kind of remember and ground ourselves as people who turn to God, that God is our kind of our ultimate authority in our lives. Another thing that we're asking and inviting people to do is to fast from one thing throughout this month. We've participated in fasting as a church before, and it has been a powerful practice. And we're inviting you to do that again. It could be a meal, it could be from social media, it could be from coffee, if you're really bold for some of you Seattleites, it could be from video games. Whatever it is, what that does is it gives us space and room in our lives to give over to God as a daily, even hard reminder that we follow after Jesus, that Jesus is Lord or commander, as it is in the Greek. And so that's another way for us to remember who we are. So we encourage you to do that. And then lastly, we're going to have a special time of communion on Sunday, November the 1st. That's the last Sunday before the presidential election. We're going to have our regular live stream service, but after the live stream service, we're going to host an in-person communion here at the church. So you can drive through the church parking lot, and the pastors will give you the elements, or you can walk to the front door, and we will provide communion for you there. But again, it's a way for us to remember our identity, that we are people who are here because of the body and the blood of Jesus, that we are Christ's followers ultimately. And to let everything that we do and we say and all of our actions kind of overflow from that identity. So we encourage you, whether it's one of those activities or all of them, these are just ways for us in this chaotic, really noisy season to remind ourselves every day of our identity as followers of Jesus and our ultimate citizenship being with the kingdom of heaven. So we hope that you'll participate with us in these things. The other thing that I did want to make mention before I begin is something that's been on the news and maybe many of us have heard about and have been thinking about, and that's the news about Breonna Taylor, who is a young black woman in Louisville, Kentucky, who was shot and killed in a drug bust gone bad, where she was completely innocent of anything and she lost her life. And it was recently announced that no charges would be brought to anyone. Essentially, no one was to blame for her death. And I wanted to talk about this, but not from like a legal or political perspective. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, and so I'm not really a good authority on to tell us, what should change. Instead, I wanted to kind of have a more pastoral perspective on this, and maybe to remind us, before we skip to talking about what needs to be changed and the issues at hand, to remember that a human being that God created and God loved lost her life. That I want to begin with with that perspective, and although the issues that have to be addressed are really important, I don't want to bypass Breonna Taylor as a person. And just that she was loved by God and loved by others. She was a daughter and a friend to people. And just to kind of sit with that and imagine if it were our friend or our sister or our daughter or our mother or whatever it might be, just to let that human weight kind of sit with us before we move on. And I think it's just humane for us to do that. It's important for us to do that, but it also kind of highlights the wrongness. Right, that you can justify it if we have a kind of a legal, political perspective. We can justify it or say, oh, the laws weren't broken or the rules weren't broken, and so this was justified. But from a human perspective, we can never say that. You never go up to someone's mother, or if this was your sister, and say, well, the rules were obeyed, and so there was nothing that went wrong. We know from a human level, if we saw this from a human perspective, a human being losing their life innocently, that's wrong. Regardless of what laws or rules were broken or not, it's the human perspective that keys us into the wrongness of what happened, the wrongness of her losing her life. And so I think that's just, we can't lose sight of that and jump to the debate about the legality of it, because you can say something's right or wrong legally, but from a human perspective and from a child of God perspective, it's wrong. And there's no really two ways about it. And so I think that's one thing that I would remind us of. The other thing that, again, from a human perspective, I would remind us of is the impact upon our black brothers and sisters around us. And we have to recognize this is not just one name. This is one name added to the list of names. To George Floyd, and to Ahmaud Arbery, to Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Trayvon Martin. The list goes on and on. I can't sadly remember all of the names that are part of that list. This is not just one story or one thing that happens. This is now a litany that goes through hundreds of names throughout hundreds of years. That's really what we're thinking about when we think about the impact upon people that we love, on our black brothers and sisters. And not just that, but that these deaths could be justified by saying, well, they were wearing a hoodie, or they were running in the wrong neighborhood, or he said he didn't, was resisting arrest, or whatever it might be, that their lives could be justified through these small little things. This is what we need to think about, is this is an accumulation of trauma and the anxiety that's to come with it, the pain that's to come with it. When I talk to friends now, they're not shocked by this. The shock is way past at this point. Now it's just this long-standing chronic trauma and anxiety that people are feeling. And I think we have to recognize that's what people are feeling. It's not one name. Now it's hundreds of names that reinforced by hundreds of years of history. And that's what our families are going through. That's what our black brothers and sisters are experiencing right now. But I think that also keys us into what we need to do for those of us who are not black, that we can't give up. This is much bigger than just one name or one instance or a couple of things that happened this year. This is huge. And social media eventually is going to stop talking about one name or another, and we're going to get tired and we're going to say, oh, I can't deal with this. I got to put it to the side or whatever it might be. And we have to realize there are people who can't put this to the side, that they have to deal with this day after day. And that we can't give up on this. We can't get fatigued now. Even though the protests have stopped or it may go out of the news cycle, we have to recognize that this is something that we have to carry. We can't just lay it to the side because it's not popular or it's not in the news right now. This is something that is affecting people, and we have to commit ourselves to being the last generation that will allow such blatant anti-blackness to exist in this country. We have to commit ourselves to this. Otherwise, it's just going to happen again and again. If we get emotionally and spiritually fatigued in this, it's just going to happen again. The task in front of us is enormous, and so we can't turn away from it. And I think approaching it from a human angle will hopefully inspire us to keep with this, no matter what it might cost us. And I think the other thing that we need to do as a church that kind of goes over or around the legal, political perspective is prayer. So maybe I could ask you to pray with me before we get into the sermon. Dear God, there is so much to pray for that feels so overwhelming and feels like waves, huge waves crashing down upon us. The upcoming election feels, it's giving us a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear about what is going to happen, God. Help us, Lord, to find a safe harbor in you, to remind us that you slept while the waves were crashing around the disciples, not because you did not care, but because of your identity as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So even as the waves of this election and all these things that are happening, help us to remember that you are still God. Help us to follow after you as our God. Help us to be heralds and proclaimers of the kingdom and your character and who you are to this world, Lord. Help us to find ourselves in you in this season. And God, we also want to lift up the name and the memory and the family of Breonna Taylor as a human being, not as a hashtag, but as a person who lost their lives. And regardless of the legal things or regardless of the legal debate, we just want to say that it was a tragedy and it was wrong for her to lose her life. And we want to start there and not just bypass that tragedy, God. We want to just let that sit with us. We also want to remember the human impact upon our brothers and sisters, that the human impact upon the people that we love, our black family members, is not going to be lessened by legal justifications or saying one thing or whatever it might be, that the human impact is manifest and it is multiplied by so many instances, God. And through this human perspective, God, that you would empower us and you would help us to commit to whatever needs to be done. That the image of God might be preserved, that this narrative that black lives do not matter in this country, that we would find the courage and we would find the strength to stand and disrupt it and to contradict it, both in word but also in action as well, in whatever it would take, God. Help us to commit to this fully and to all that it requires from us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. With that, I do want to enter into our actual sermon for today. We are talking about grace. And the perspective, the approach we've been taking about grace is that grace is incredibly important, but also incredibly difficult. There's that tension with grace, right? It's so fundamental, but there may not be a more difficult concept to live out than the concept of grace. And I think nothing reflects that tension of grace better than the parable of the unmerciful servant, or what I often think of as the most unbelievable parable. And I think about it as an unbelievable parable because I cannot imagine anyone actually doing what the unmerciful servant does here, right? I can't imagine someone being forgiven of $1 million debt and then in the next second, the next moment, turning around and shaking down someone for $100. It's just, who would ever do that? That's just totally unbelievable, and because of that, we feel we kind of keep it at arm's length. That no one could ever be that contradictory. No one could be that unaware of themselves. No one would ever be that hypocritical. And so we just can't imagine we would ever see anyone do that, much less ourselves. But in reflecting on this passage, what I have come to realize, this story hits dangerously close to home. That I think many of us, if not all of us, myself very much included, do something very, very similar. But in order to understand why and when we do this, we have to understand how fundamental grace is to the faith. This is what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. And every word means something. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. In these two short verses, Paul is describing the nature of salvation, the nature of faith, and as he describes that, he is basically making it clear that it's all a gift. That our faith, Christianity, is a gift that's given to us. We can claim no part of it. We weren't good. We don't deserve it. We didn't earn it. We were just given it to it. Even the word grace is the word charis, which means gift in Greek. Our faith is a gift. It was just handed to us, and we did nothing to earn it. We can't boast about any of it. And it just points to a very fundamental but easily forgotten aspect of the Christian life, which is this. Christianity is not about people getting what they deserve, but the exact opposite. It is about us being given a gift that we did not earn. You see, oftentimes when it comes to Christianity, there is this common popular perspective that Christianity is the religion that if you do good things, God will love you. If you obey what it says in the Bible, you will get into heaven. It's a very transactional kind of religion, right? Where you do the good stuff, you get the good stuff. And that's a very easy way for us to understand Christianity. In fact, many of us, and myself included, we often kind of just operate in that mentality. But we have to recognize Christianity is the opposite of that. It's the exact polar opposite of transaction. It is gift. It is, we did nothing right, but we get Jesus. We were sinners, and yet God would offer his own life up on the cross. That is Christianity. Christianity is not about earning, it's about receiving. It is not about wages, it's about a gift. We are a people who are here because of a gift, because of generosity. I'm not here up in front of you because I'm better than anyone else. I'm here because God is good, not because I'm good. Because God is who he is. Because God is generous, not because I was generous. And so we have to remember, this is fundamental. Without grace, without the gift, without God's generosity, there is no church, there is no Christianity, there is no believers whatsoever. It is fundamental to what it means to be a Christ follower. And yet, as fundamental as grace is to our identity as Christians, we do something where we compartmentalize that grace. And what I mean by compartmentalizing grace is this. Even though we are a people of grace, we decide that grace does not work or apply to certain situations or to certain people, right? We are fully people who are here by grace. It's only by God's generosity and God's love and God's goodness that we're here, not about ourselves. Our faith is a gift from God. Right? That's who we are. And yet, in certain aspects of our lives, when we think or process or live out those aspects of our lives, we take a more worldly approach. We take up that transactional approach, that kind of, if someone's good, I'll give them good. If they're bad, I'll give them bad. It's that kind of wages kind of thing. With certain spheres of our lives, we take that approach. Even though we, on the whole, are people who are here by grace, there is little fiefdoms throughout our lives where grace does not apply. We say, yes, grace generally, but here, you can't really live out grace. It doesn't work there. It doesn't make sense. There are so many ways in which we do this. So many little spheres where we kind of compartmentalize grace out of it, or we push grace out of those places. I think maybe the most obvious and comical is driving when we're on the road. How many of us out there, when we are driving our cars, we think, this is a place for me to live out the grace of God. This is a canvas for me to express the grace that I have received freely from God. No, I don't think many of us do. I certainly don't. Right? It's eye for an eye. It's tooth for a tooth out there. When I see someone weaving in and out of traffic and they're cutting people off to get ahead, and then they want to merge, no, they're not going to merge. Over my dead body are they going to merge. If I have to crash into the car in front of me and put it in park and then lay down in front of them, they are not going to merge. Because you were driving bad, you don't get to go in front of me now. There's no way that's going to happen. Right? Very much like you did bad, you don't get good things. Bad does not get good. Right? It's just kind of very logical. Right? Even though Christianity and grace is you get good even though you did bad. We invert it for driving, and we say, not for driving though. Driving, we've got to act a little differently. Right? It's kind of funny, but I think in some ways we do that with many spheres of our lives. We kind of protect it from grace. Another example are certain relationships in our lives. That there are certain relationships, when we approach them and we think about them, we have more of a worldly kind of attitude about them where we say, yes, I understand grace. I got good things even though I was bad, but this person, we got to teach them a lesson. They're never going to learn. They're never going to change their behavior unless I treat them kind of the way that they have deserved. And that's the only way they're going to change their behavior. They treated me badly. They treat others badly, so I have to treat them badly. It's just, this is different. This person is different. could be a coworker, it could even be a family member or a spouse, but we take this kind of more worldly, hard-nosed approach to this person. We often have that perspective when it comes to our finances, right? When we think about financial things, we don't often think about it as being grace. We think about that as being outside of grace, right? We don't say, well, people just get money for free and you can buy things without working. No, financially, you have to work in order to get money, in order to pay for the stuff that you get. So finances usually are often kind of a protected fiefdom from grace. It's like, grace doesn't apply when it comes to money. But then it also applies to people who don't have money too. It extends beyond our personal finances, and we often think about people who are experiencing poverty, and we say, yeah, if they're not going to work and they're not going to get a job, I don't see why we should give them housing or give them food, right? We should give them the things if they're going to work for it. And so we often think about financial situations or people who are caught up in financial situations outside of grace. Another example of that is the legal system. People who have been caught up in criminal behavior. Again, when we think about the legal system and criminal justice, we think to ourselves, yeah, grace doesn't really apply there. People should pay for what they've done, right? That if they've done a crime, then they should pay for it. It's very natural and very logical for us to think about that. Even though, again, spiritually speaking, and our identity as Christians that's not true. We were sinners. We were enemies to God, and yet God gave us the most abundant gift of his own son, Jesus. But when it comes to people who have done wrong, who are sinners, who have done something wrong, they should receive punishment. I just want to point out, this is so natural, and I made this list because I do these things. I don't make this list to say, you're bad. I'm just saying it's so natural that we do this. But in all of our lives, we have these places where we just say, yeah, grace doesn't apply here. It doesn't work. I can't do it, or whatever the case might be. But it just fears that we do that. And I think for each of us, it's good for us just to take a moment and ask ourselves where we do that. What is the situation or person in your life where you find yourself setting grace aside? Where, yes, grace is why you are a believer, but grace does not apply there. It doesn't apply to that context. It doesn't apply to that person. It's so natural. It's so natural when we do that. But it's actually incredibly dangerous as well. First off, when we compartmentalize grace, we are no different from the unmerciful servant who also set aside the grace he had received. Let's think about what we do again. We are here only by the grace of God, through the generosity of God. We have done nothing. It's solely that God gave us something. We were bad, he gave us good. That's who we are. But in certain times of our lives, we compartmentalize that and we put it to the side and we say, yes, grace, but in this situation, driving this annoying person or whatever the case might be, that doesn't apply anymore. I don't need to live out grace in this place. Right? That's what we do. We do it every day. We do it multiple times in our lives. In essence, how is that different from the unmerciful servant? Is that not exactly what he did? Didn't he receive this abundant forgiveness, and yet he turns, and this other sphere of his life, this private financial matter, says, yeah, I understand, but I'm going to push that away. It doesn't apply here to this person. It doesn't apply to this guy. He needs to be treated a little differently. He needs to be treated a little harshly so he can learn a lesson here. It's not really that different at all when you think about it. And so that same sense of contradiction, that same lack of self-awareness, that same hypocrisy applies to us. We may not think about it that way. We may think, no, my situation is different when I've received grace, but I don't apply it to that part of my life. But I would really question, why is that? Why is it any different at all when we do the exact same thing as the unmerciful servant? I don't really think it is. I really don't think it is. We're no different from this man. The other thing we have to recognize about this practice of compartmentalizing grace is the more we compartmentalize grace from aspects of our lives, the more grace goes from being our very identity to just being our hobby. We said theologically, we are people of grace. We are gift receivers. That's another way to understand what grace is and who we are. It is our identity as Christians. But what does it mean to our identity when we pick places of our lives where it need not apply? Where it simply doesn't apply in that situation. Yes, I will worship God because of this. I will sing about this. I've read books about it, but here I don't need to do it. Here also, that also doesn't apply. How can we really say that grace is who we are and it's our identity when we have all these little pockmarked fiefdoms in our lives where we say, yeah, but grace doesn't apply here or there? We can't legitimately say that grace is our identity in that situation. It's only our hobby. We pick and choose when it applies. We pick and choose when we should live it out. We pick and choose when it's effective or not effective, when we want to do it or when we do not. We can no longer say that we are a people of grace. We can only legitimately say we are hobbyists. We are dabblers. We are dilettantes if we take this kind of attitude towards grace. In order for us to fully claim that identity as people of grace, we need to allow it to influence every aspect of our lives. That is incredibly difficult to do. A few reasons why I think letting grace touch everything in our lives is so hard. Number one, when we compartmentalize grace, we often do so for justified reasons. You know, in those situations where we are setting aside grace and looking at things from a more worldly perspective, every single time we do that, there is logic behind it. There is a justification behind it, right? When we think that way about a person, it's usually because they've hurt us. It's usually because they've hurt us in some really bad way, and so that is why we feel like we have to take this approach. Not because we want to, but because we feel we've got to change their behavior. There's justification behind it. Why do we not just give money freely to people who are poor and who are homeless? Because we don't know how it's going to be used, right? We don't know. Maybe they'll buy drugs and they'll worsen their own condition, or they don't have the financial management to really know what to do with that money. There's logic behind it. That makes it really difficult to kind of just let grace reign in all these spheres of our lives. Another reason why this is so difficult to do, we often are paralyzed by the most extreme example of grace that we can imagine. I had a hard time writing this sermon because as I was writing about these examples where we compartmentalize grace, my mind immediately jumped to the most extreme counter-example possible. I don't know if you do this, but when I was thinking about, people that we are hard-nosed about and we've got to show them grace, my pessimistic mind immediately thought, so does that mean when someone hurts me or maybe even abuses me, I need to just say, I forgive you, and I let them do it again? Is that what you're telling me? Or when it comes to someone who is homeless, we need to just give them money, give them a home, no matter if they can use it correctly, no matter if maybe they're addicted to drugs, and just do that? Is that what you're telling me? That if someone's committed a grievous crime against someone else, we just say, grace, go ahead, go out and do whatever you want to do. Is that what you're telling me? And when I do that, I can't think anymore. I can't even engage this. I'm like, no, it's too extreme, it's too hard, and so I need to walk away from the entire concept of grace because so often I am fixated and paralyzed by the most extreme possible variation of what grace might look like. Does anyone else feel like that? You jump to that example, and so grace is off the table because of that. It's another reason why I think we have such a hard time letting grace touch everything. It's because we are trapped by the most extreme version of what grace might look like. Thirdly, grace is hard to allow in every part of our lives because compartmentalizing grace is often an unconscious decision. How many of us, as we thought about that one aspect of our lives where we did not want to live out grace, where we have this more worldly, good for good, bad for bad approach, did it consciously? That we sat there and we said to ourselves, with this situation, shall I choose a grace approach that I received from God through Jesus, or will I be worldly about this one? I shall choose worldliness this time around. How many of us were that conscious about that situation, about that person? Very few of us, if any of us. It was more often than not an unconscious thing that we slipped into. that we didn't even make a decision about, and yet we acted that way. And that makes it especially difficult to root out because it just was a subconscious decision. It's so hard to let grace find its way into every aspect of our lives because of these reasons. And that is why I would suggest to us as a good starting point for us is to begin with a question. And that question is this: what might grace look like in this situation or with this person? To just begin by asking that simple question. Now, we might be saying to ourselves, what is that going to do? How is that possibly going to help? How is a question going to begin to let grace seep into all the aspects of our lives? Well, a few reasons why I think this question can be really important for us. Number one, no matter what we choose, grace was not compartmentalized any longer because it influenced our decision. You see, when we ask that question in those spheres where we don't allow grace, we have allowed grace. We've allowed it in the form of that question. We've allowed it into that protected sphere by less challenging us, by causing us to pause, by causing us to wrestle for a little bit. It's not compartmentalized. It's not protected anymore. It's made its way in there. No, maybe it has not changed our perspective. We haven't made the choice to be gracious, but it's no longer compartmentalized. At the very least, the question itself has begun to seep in. It's begun to influence those spheres in a way that it did not before. Another reason why this question can be so powerful to us is that it allows us to imagine multiple expressions of grace for ourselves, releasing us from being paralyzed by the most extreme examples. This question is, what might grace look like in this situation or with this person? It does not dictate to any of us what grace looks like. It does not tell you, do this one thing. Do the most extreme version. It allows us to be creative. It allows us to imagine what grace might look like and to no longer be paralyzed by these extreme examples that we feel we can't do any longer. It allows us to say, when we talk about the justice system, instead of just being trapped by saying, so we need to let criminals just roam the streets. No, we don't. That's not the only option here. Maybe creativity is something different. Maybe it's something like Choose 180 or community passageways. Maybe it's thinking about justice not as punishment for people, but a means and a process to restoration. Maybe that's what grace looks like. You see, this question gives us space to imagine grace taking place and manifesting itself in hundreds of ways, and not simply that one way that we can't do ultimately. It allows us to think about it in those multitude of ways. Thirdly, this question invites us to see grace not as a one-time choice, but a long-term process or a journey. I think oftentimes, again, what paralyzes us when it comes to thinking about grace in those protected spheres is that it's too hard to do that one thing. I just can't do it. I can't do that one big mammoth thing that I'm imagining grace to be. And so we don't. We just back away and we say, it's too hard to imagine, it's too hard to even consider, so let's just let it sit. Just let it be that way. But this question reframes grace as kind of a process instead. That grace begins with a question where we look at that sphere and we let grace begin to nibble away at it. And to weaken it, and to infiltrate it a little bit, and to make us feel uncomfortable. Wait, I'm a person of grace, aren't I? So what might it look like? I'm not ready, but what might it look like? And then maybe we imagine a baby step of saying, well, I want to think about it differently. Or maybe I'll take this step, and then maybe I'll take that step. And before we know it, we are taking steps in the path and the journey of grace, instead of being overwhelmed by the hill of Calvary that's in front of us saying, I can never get there, we just take one step after one step, and before we know it, we are living a life of grace instead. And that's why I think this question, just starting with this question, can be such a good starting point for us. But I want us to also remember the vision, or what ultimately we should be thinking about. The goal of all this is this: that every part of our lives would be influenced by the grace that makes us who we are. that we might be able to honestly say that there is not one part of our lives that's not being shaped and challenged and influenced and ultimately completely dominated by grace. That is the vision. Can you just imagine what the world would look like if every Christian's life, and every part of a Christian's life, was influenced by the grace that has created us? Maybe not that we're doing the crazy stuff that we can't do, but it's questioning us. It's challenging us. And it's causing us to take steps forward in grace, what things might look like. With all of that, I just want to leave you with this one final thought. Think back again to that situation or that person where you know you are setting aside grace, where grace just doesn't apply. We just kind of say, no, not grace there. And just for today, don't think about the most crazy example of what you might do. Just ask yourself this. But what might grace look like in that situation? What might grace look like for that person? Let it begin to break through that compartmentalization. Let it begin to inspire you to imagine what grace could look like in all of its forms. And let it start you on the journey towards letting grace be all of who you are instead of part of who you are instead. I hope you'll take time to do that throughout this week so that we can let grace permeate and let grace become who we are.